I'm John.
And I'm Jeff.
And welcome to the next episode of Love and Other Investments. I thought today Jeff and I might talk a little bit about one of the ways that couples try to push back against finding themselves in a place in their relationship where arguing over finances has really kind of started to stack up and cause some problems. And I think one of the things that couples do, and tell me if you think I'm wrong here, but there's kind of a moment where you go, hey, there's something broken in the way that we communicate. There's something broken about you, or maybe
a lot of finger pointing.
And maybe we need to go to therapy. Maybe we've reached that magic moment where, therapy is the answer to this.
Sure.
And, I think it's kind of interesting because I think you and I would both say that you don't have to be a mess to benefit from therapy.
Oh, for sure.
So jump into that for just a minute.
Yeah, I mean, there's a common misconception, I think, about therapy, which is to say that it is directly analogous to medicine. If I have a cold and the symptoms that go with the cold, then I should go to the doctor, which of course is true. I mean, for medicine, of course, go to the doctor when you're sick, right?
Right.
But in the therapy world, one does not need to be sick, metaphorically, figuratively, in order to benefit from talking with someone. And, I can hear all the people cock their heads. Like, what are you talking about, Jeff? So, we have this diagnostic manual called the DSM. You probably heard of that. It's around. I mean, people sort of have a general understanding of what this giant manual is. It lists all the mental health symptoms that, are sort of currently thought to be used in categorizing disorders, right?
Okay.
Diagnosis. Does that make sense?
Sure.
You might have significant problems in life, but not find your experience located in that manual. So I'll give you an example. What if you're going through a divorce? There's no diagnostic code for divorce in the DSM.
But yet it's very distressing.
Very
and
distressing. Very distressing.
Disorienting.
Right.
Lots of those things.
Right. So I don't think we should be thinking about when to go to therapy based on whether or not you have a mental health diagnosis. I think you should go because something feels distressing or upsetting, or there's something in life that's holding you back and you feel like you want to grow. And you need someone who's outside you and not in your circumstance, not in your orbit, who doesn't really know you, who can give you their thoughts and from their experience give you, feedback about what's going on in your life.
And I think we're kind of programmed to think that way because we have things like, physical therapy. When do you go to physical therapy? You go after surgery or after an injury.
Right.
What about occupational therapy? Well, when you're trying to come back from a brain injury or,
right.
Who knows what else.
Right.
Speech therapy. It is when we use the word therapy in, English, we're typically assuming that there's something broken.
Something wrong. Yeah.
And so I think a lot of times when we think, oh, there's something wrong in our relationship because we're fighting about money, we kind of think, well, who is the therapist? Is it a physical, occupational, speech? No, it's
psychotherapist.
Marriage and
right.
It's the psychotherapist.
Right.
And maybe there is something wrong. Maybe there is something that you could benefit from, that you could find in your book. But I think more often than not, I see people say, well, we have this problem in our relationship and we need to call it something. We need to give it a name. And sometimes just saying, oh, we argue about money, so we probably need a therapist is, I think, in some ways kind of a defense mechanism just to say, what do we call this thing? Well, we call it a mental problem, or we call it a relationship problem.
Sure.
Or if I'm feeling spicy, I might just call it my spouse's problem.
Yeah. Back to the finger pointing kind
Back
of
to
deal.
the
right?
finger pointing. So do you ever see people say, hey, we really, the only way we're going to solve this is if we go to therapy? Have you ever seen people say that type of thing with no intent to go to therapy?
Oh, for sure. I mean, this is therapy. If the idea of going to therapy can be used as a club, right? To whack your partner with, you're sort of suggesting that they're crazy. And the only way this is ever going to get better is if they admit that they're crazy and they need to go to therapy. I mean, surely you've heard of spouses having or partners having arguments like that. I think when we have arguments, we tend to want to believe that the problem is not residing inside us. We've not contributed to it. It's really us reacting rationally to the other one being irrational, right? That's how we think of it. And of course, that's not true. In the vast majority of cases, we're both participants in whatever the dilemmas are. But yeah, I mean, if you want to use a club and beat on your partner a little bit, just tell them they need to go to therapy.
Without the actual express intent of actually following through on it. Yeah.
Right.
So, I would say, getting back to some mechanics here, couples that have consistent arguments or fights over money really typically have two components to it. They're rarely 50-50, but there's two strong components. And one is a financial component.
Sure.
You're fighting because there's something that's scarce. If I have, $10,000 in the checking account and all the bills are paid and I know there's another check coming in and I go out and, blow $40 on a dozen golf balls, that's probably not that it couldn't, but that's probably not going to spark an argument.
Sure.
But if we have $60 in the checking account or $30 in the checking account and I go spend $40 on golf balls on a credit card,
Sure.
I might be risking a moment.
An argument?
A moment. A moment of intense fellowship. Right?
Argument.
Especially if it's not the first time that it's happened, or for a myriad of reasons. I'm doing it to reciprocate the reason that we only have $40 in the checkbooks because you spent it all.
Right.
You can see how.
Sure.
Anyway, so I think we've got to recognize that there are two active components. There's a financial component that deals with the fact that we're feeling stress because there's not enough money to go around and do all the things that each of us wants to do.
You're talking about the objective numbers, right? The
Correct.
Addition and subtraction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it can be in lots of structures. It can be, I don't think we're saving enough for retirement and you're out spending money. It can be, I don't feel good about the amount of money that we have in savings and you're out spending money.
Right.
Or, and it can be about it doesn't just have to be on the expense side. It can be on the income side. I really wish you would apply yourself and ask for a raise or go for the promotion. You've passed up 2 promotions because you think they're going to be stressful, but we really would benefit from the resources.
Right.
Those are all open arguments about not being on the same page just financially about what it is that we want to do and how it is that we want to do it.
Sure.
But I think there's another aspect to it, and I think you've alluded to it just a little bit in your conversation before, and that is that each of us has grown up with different experiences. And so what I think is the right way to deal with our scarcity, or what I think is the right way to deal with savings, obviously seems right to me, and you don't seem to connect to it, or my spouse doesn't seem to connect to it.
Sure.
And so my spouse must be nuts, or
Wrong.
irresponsible, or wrong,
Yeah.
or inconsiderate.
Right. Selfish.
Yeah. So
Yeah. I mean, you're obviously, we've talked about this many times. This is not a new subject in our discussions, but, there are really 2 components, the one you just mentioned and the second one, which is sort of the relational/psychological part about how we think and feel about money. That part of our experience of money has to do with how we grow up. The people who are important to us in our growing up teach us overtly and covertly about what money is for, about what it does and what it means. So, you were alluding a minute ago to the more objective side of thing, like what happens under circumstances of scarcity. If you come from a family where there's always enough, you're multimillionaires, let's say, and there's always enough, then scarcity has a different meaning than if you come from a family where they fell below the poverty line. It's a totally different meaning. So how people make meaning of money determines what they're going to do, to some extent, in their relationship with their partner.
Especially when they're under stress.
Especially under stress. And as you point out, scarcity is certainly one way in which people find themselves in duress.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
I want to bring something up here, and I've kind of set you up to do it. I guess I manipulated you. We'll call that fun.
No.
And that is that you mentioned that we talk about this a lot in our videos.
Yeah.
And it's something that I picked up that you've done quite a few times, which is to repeat a basic concept, even though we've talked about it before.
Right.
So our listener hears you say, hey, you grew up in a place that was different than that of your spouse.
Right.
And then 3 episodes later, you'll say, hey, you were raised in a family that did things different than the family that your spouse was raised in. And then an episode later, you'll go, your spouse was probably raised in a slightly different environment.
Right.
So
you see a pattern?
yeah.
Yeah.
It's not always the same, but it's always the same thing.
Right.
So you're doing that on purpose.
Right.
You're doing that without going, ooh, shoot, I'm repeating myself. What are you doing?
Well, one of the most important things that I think all of us come to understand, or the vast majority of us come to understand at some point in our development, in our life, is that our own perspective is not the only perspective. This might sound very simple, and in some ways it is. But the truth is, we come to that understanding after having some bumps in the road, where somebody has to sort of teach us over time that, in fact, our own perspective is only one of many, many, many perspectives, and that it is incumbent on us to be, sort of good family members and good friends and good colleagues and so forth, by understanding that my vantage point is not the same vantage point as someone else's. And therefore, they need to have some kind of equal, consideration. So, when I make the point that people grew up in different families, I want them to consider the possibility that they're not right because they think a certain thing happens a certain way in their family does not mean that way is the right way. Because, you've heard the saying, you can be right or you can be happy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's sort of how it applies to relationships, right? Like you need to be able to see that the other person's perspective has its own value and its own meaning. And in fact, one reason that you're attracted to that person and decided to have a serious relationship with them is because they have a different vantage point that you like. Mm-hmm. You might also not like it sometimes, but especially in arguments, where you think you're right and the other person's wrong.
There's an old saying that says that history doesn't repeat itself, but historians do.
Yeah.
It's kind of a twist on the original phrase. And I want to just kind of pull the covers off for a minute and let people see mechanically, from a therapy standpoint, why it is that you will often repeat the same thing slightly differently or from a different perspective. Right. Why isn't it enough to tell somebody one time that, hey, you were raised in a different family, so be cognizant of the fact that the other person isn't less right than you. Right. Why do you have to repeat it? Yeah,
it's a great question. When we grow up, we learn, we're constantly learning. Like we're learning machines, really. And we're taking in all of the lessons that happen around us, whether they're explicit or implicit, obvious or not obvious, hidden, and we draw conclusions. In other words, whatever it was we learned from a particular lesson, we apply that to everywhere else, right? We generalize that knowledge, which is a good thing until it's not a good thing. And in that circumstance, we might make mistakes about the generalization we're making and make an error. And so when I repeat things, one reason I do that is because I'm trying to slowly, over time, introduce an idea that doesn't just have intellectual value. The first time I said it, that's its intellectual value, right? Like everyone can understand the concept. It's not really a hard concept at all.
Sure.
But the second time and the 2+ times after that, I'm attempting to say something that kind of perturbs the not quite conscious lessons in one's history. It challenges them and tries to disrupt them in a way, so that some new kind of learning could occur over time. So it's a kind of influence, right? Like
So it's a move from saying that I intellectually understand this and I can see how that would apply to other people.
Yes.
To I intellectually understand that and I'm starting to maybe even ponder the idea that it applies to me.
Yes.
And then the third time or the 12th time
right,
through,
or the 100th time.
or the 100th time
Right.
through, it's, oh, I'm starting to see the places where I do that, and that's probably not fair to my spouse.
Yes.
And maybe I need to listen differently,
Yes.
think differently, participate differently,
Feel differently.
feel differently.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to say that having the knowledge, the intellectual or academic knowledge, right, is necessary but not sufficient to making change. You may need to go through a process where you kind of try to understand a particular concept like the one we're talking about right now. But until it's felt in a different way, you're not quite there in terms of changing.
Yeah, I mean, I think of this, and we've talked about this analogy before, but I know that in order to lose 15 pounds, I need to move more and eat less.
Yes, exactly.
Intellectually, I totally get that.
Totally.
That doesn't keep my hands from shoving things into my face.
Correct.
Because it's true, but it's not true yet to me in a way that
and
changes
think about
behavior.
all the mental gymnastics you do when that happens, because it's not just that you're taking food and putting it in your mouth. You're also saying something like, oh, well, I'll ride the bike, 20 minutes more to make up for this.
Which I won't.
Right.
And so there's this internal argument where what I've learned in the past about how to eat and when to eat and why I eat and how it makes me feel to eat is in conflict with
correct
my intellectual state.
We all have internal conflict almost all the time running in the background.
So we've done this all on purpose. We've had this conversation on purpose to help answer the question of, will therapy help eliminate some of the arguments that we have as a couple around finances? And so I hope what people are starting to hear is, hey, there's a financial component that deals with arithmetic.
Right.
That one's easy because it's arithmetic. It's not calculus. It's not, heat transfer. We're not talking physics or rocket science. But I hope what people could see is it's the same equivalent of saying, you know what, if you could just move a little bit more and eat a little bit less, you guys will, not have as many financial problems and think I've solved something. We come into these relationships with long established patterns of how we view the world and how we view our needs. And money becomes just one of those resources, not unlike food, right?
Sure.
And so when we get into arguments, we're basically doing this thing all over again. And so I just want to throw out there that if you're having reoccurring arguments over finances, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be in therapy. That's not my point.
Sure.
But my point is there are things that are going on that you came to this moment, and it may have taken you 10 or 15 years to learn a pattern that's very difficult to unwind.
Right.
It may have been a pattern that was established through big events or just lots of small events.
Right.
And it is not an easy thing, and it takes a lot of effort to interrupt those patterns and listen differently and participate differently in those conversations about finance.
Yeah, therapy isn't going to stop people from having arguments. That's not the point. That's not the function of what therapy is, right? We're not necessarily trying to prevent arguments. We're trying to help your arguments be an expression of love rather than control or conflict. We're trying to help it so that when you approach the other person, the person that you love, you're doing so with openness and kindness and thinking about their perspective, thinking about what they need, not just your own needs, instead of finger pointing or having contempt or blowing them off or whatever. We're trying to help people have a reasonable pathway to solving the conflict, the problem that's come up in their life.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of what we're doing in this podcast, in these episodes, first of all, is not therapy, because we're not.
Yeah, I'm not your therapist.
Yeah,
no.
You're not talking to somebody specifically.
No.
And you couldn't possibly listen into, what they're saying over and over again.
And you're not their financial advisor.
There's no financial planning going on in these episodes.
Right.
But yet we're talking about the tools, and we're talking about the common conditions that people find themselves in.
Right.
And what are some of the structures that exist in relationships that make it difficult to escape these patterns?
Right.
And I think that's what needs to be, if you're listening in with us, why would you stay with us? Because we're going to be talking about things that very likely you do, that even if you're aware of doing them, they are not easy things to change.
Yeah, we're trying to understand the complexity, right? Because just like this question, the question of, is therapy going to help you stop arguing? That's a loaded question, right?
Sure.
You and I both know the answer to that question.
Mm-hmm.
It's a much more complex thing to actually think about what would it mean to meaningfully reduce the amount of discord in a relationship. How does one go about doing that, especially around money?
Mm-hmm.
And we have lots of thoughts about that.
Right.
That are sometimes simple, but never easy.
They're all things that need to be handled and played with over time.
Yeah.
And they need to be done together,
right,
with a curiosity and an openness of willing to admit that, I see blue a certain way and you see blue a certain way. But we've decided to be in this relationship together, and we've decided to create something unique to us. And that, while it was really fun at the beginning, we've gotten to the place where now it feels like work. But all the things that we thought were fun about each other probably also still exist. We just need to find a way to work through these new challenges. And so that's what we're trying to do, is provide information about why you find yourself in these places, to try to maybe just broaden the idea of what it is that we face as couples when we're trying to work through these issues.
For sure.
All right. Well, join us again next time when we get together and take a whack at some of this stuff.
Yeah. See you then.
All right.